My son's fiancée asked about the deed to our family land 3 times before Thanksgiving, and twice more by Christmas. I told myself she was just curious about our history, the way newcomers sometimes are when they discover how long a family has worked the same Tennessee soil. Frank would have seen through her immediately. He always could read people in that quiet way of his, like a good carpenter reading the grain of wood before the first cut. But Frank had been gone 2 years, and I was still learning how to trust my own judgment without him standing beside me to confirm what I already knew. The note came on a Tuesday night in March, folded once, pressed into my palm as my son hugged me goodnight at the door. He squeezed my hand just a little too hard, just long enough for me to feel the paper between his fingers and mine. I didn't open it until his taillights disappeared down the gravel drive. 3 words in his handwriting, the same handwriting I'd watched develop from crayon scrawl to careful block letters to the slanted cursive he used for blueprints. 3 words. Mom, she's lying. I stood at the kitchen counter for a long time with that note in my hand. Outside, the March wind moved through the cedar trees Frank had planted along the fence line the year our son was born. The house was quiet the way old houses get quiet at night, full of sounds that are really just memory. I put the note in the pocket of my cardigan, walked to the study, sat down in Frank's chair, and started making a list. She had appeared in our lives the previous June, arriving at our son's apartment in Nashville in the kind of way that felt, in retrospect, almost too well-timed. My son had called me on a Sunday afternoon, and I could hear the change in his voice before he even said her name. Mom, I want you to meet someone. Her name is Diane. She works in estate management. I'd thought it was sweet, the coincidence of that. Frank had spent 38 years in commercial construction and property development. Our son had grown up watching his father build things meant to last. Of course, he would fall for someone who understood the language of land and legacy. Diane Holloway was 31 years old, polished in the careful way that takes effort to look effortless. She arrived at our home that first Sunday with a bottle of good wine and the kind of questions that feel like compliments. How long has this land been in your family? Did your husband build the house himself? What's the acreage out to the ridge? She had wide brown eyes that stayed steady on your face when you answered, which I had mistaken for attentiveness. That first evening, sitting on the porch watching the sun go down behind the ridge, I had almost liked her. But she came back 4 more times before Christmas, and every single visit circled back to the same territory: the property, the deed, the boundaries. What lay beyond the ridge? Whether the timber rights were separate from the surface rights, what Frank's company had been worth at the time of his passing. She wrapped the questions in warmth, in that studied concern people perform when they want something. Your son worries about you out here alone. It's so much land for one person to manage. Have you thought about simplifying things, maybe working with a financial advisor to restructure the estate? I am 67 years old. I spent 29 years as an emergency room nurse at a regional trauma center in Knoxville, and before that I raised a son mostly on my own while my husband built a company from the back of a pickup truck. I have held the hands of people dying and talked calmly through situations that would dissolve most people entirely. I am not easily rattled, and I am not, as Diane seemed to be calculating, fragile, but I was lonely. And loneliness will make you negotiate with your own better judgment in ways that nothing else will. The morning after I found the note, I called my attorney. Carol had handled Frank's estate after he died. She was the kind of woman who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and had an encyclopedic memory for every document she'd ever touched. She'd been practicing estate and property law in East Tennessee for 31 years, and she had a particular gift for the specific silence that meant she was taking something seriously. When I finished telling her about Diane, about the questions and the visits and my son's note, there was exactly that silence on the other end of the line. How long have they been together? She asked. 9 months. Engaged in December? That's fast. I know. Carol exhaled slowly. Eleanor, I'm going to pull some records, public records, professional licensing, anything attached to the name Diane Holloway. Can you give me until Thursday? I can give you until Thursday. Don't sign anything she brings you. Don't let her photograph any documents. And if she suggests any kind of financial arrangement, any power of attorney, any account restructuring, you tell her your attorney handles everything and you leave it there. I know, I said. I know you know, Carol said, but sometimes it helps to hear it out loud from someone else. After we hung up, I sat with my coffee and looked out at the cedar trees. Frank had planted them as seedlings, thin as pencils, in a line along the western fence. They were taller than the fence posts now, taller than the barn roof. He had not lived to see them reach full height. I thought about what he used to say when our son was small and brought home some neighborhood kid who made Frank uneasy. Watch what they do when they think no one's watching, Ellie. That's the only version of a person you can trust. I hadn't been watching carefully enough. I intended to start. Thursday came with an ice storm that kept the roads dangerous until noon. Carol called at 2 in the afternoon, and her voice carried something careful and controlled that I had learned over the years to recognize as the sound of bad news being managed. "There's no licensed estate manager in Tennessee named Diane Holloway," she said. "No professional certification, no business registration, nothing in the state licensing database." She paused. "There is a Diane Holloway born 1,993 inches Chattanooga with a prior civil judgment for fraud in 2019. A business dispute settled out of court. The details are sealed, but the judgment exists." My hands were steady on the phone. What else? I made some calls. A colleague in Atlanta had a case 2 years ago involving a woman matching her description. Different name, different city. A woman named Cassandra Lane. She'd become engaged to the son of a retired physician in Savannah, a widower with significant assets. When the family started asking questions, she disappeared. The physician's son lost 8 months and whatever he'd believed about that relationship. Carol paused again. "My colleague is looking for a third case. She thinks there may be one in Virginia." "A professional," I said. "Yes." "And Eleanor. The civil judgment in 2019? The case involved a claim that she had attempted to obtain power of attorney over an elderly client's finances by misrepresenting her credentials. The case settled. She was never charged criminally. I thought about every conversation Diane had steered toward my finances, every question about the deed, the timber rights, Frank's company, every gentle suggestion about simplifying my estate, about how much easier things would be if someone were helping me manage. "She wasn't after the money directly," I said. "She was after control of the person who controlled the money." "That's exactly right," Carol said, "and your son is the path to you." I needed someone who could move faster than Thursday afternoon phone calls. Carol gave me a name, Ray Simmons, retired state investigator, now private. He arrived at my house the next morning in a truck with a cracked windshield and mud on the running boards, and he shook my hand without ceremony and sat down at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and listened for 45 minutes without interrupting. "What does your son know?" he asked when I finished. "He knows something is wrong. He passed me the note, but I haven't spoken to him directly yet. I didn't want to do that until I had something concrete. He loves her, or he loves the person he thinks she is. You can't dismantle that with suspicion. You need facts." Ray nodded, wrote something on his pad. "Smart. What about the house? Does she come here often?" "Once or twice a month. Sometimes with my son. Sometimes she says she's in the area and stops by alone." I sat very still for a moment. "She comes alone?" "She says she likes checking on me." He looked up from his pad. "Has she ever been in the house without you present?" I thought about the afternoon in November when I'd been out at the barn and she'd let herself in through the unlocked back door. She'd said she knocked and thought I'd heard. She was in the kitchen when I came inside, standing near Frank's desk in the corner by the window. She'd been holding his letter opener. She said she was looking at the engraving. I told Ray about that. He wrote for a long time. "I'm going to need to install cameras," he said. "Kitchen, study, main entrance. We're going to find out what she does when she thinks she's alone." He looked at me directly. "And I'm going to need to find out who she really is. Because I don't think Diane Holloway is her name." He was right. It took him 11 days. Her real name was Deanna Pratt. She had grown up in Chattanooga, dropped out of college after 2 years, and spent the better part of a decade drifting through a series of short-term relationships in mid-sized southern cities, each one ending in some version of the same story. A wealthy family, a trusting son or daughter, a pattern of questions about assets, estate structures, and power of attorney. In Memphis, she'd gotten close enough to one family that their attorney had sent a cease and desist letter. In Savannah, she'd simply vanished. In Richmond, a family had paid a private settlement to make her go away before their son's devastation became public knowledge. But the piece Ray found that made my blood run cold was not in any civil court record or attorney's letter. It was a marriage certificate filed in 2021 inches, Shelby County, Tennessee. Diana Pratt, age 28, married to a man named Curtis Webb in a courthouse ceremony. They had never divorced. My son was engaged to a woman who was already legally married to someone else. The engagement, the wedding they were planning for June, all of it would have been legally void. But that wasn't the point. The point was that Curtis Webb was not in the background of Diana Pratt's life. He was the architecture of it. Ray found them connected through a shell company registered in Georgia, a property management firm that existed only on paper and shared an address with a UPS store in Macon. Diana was the face. Curtis was the structure behind her. He managed the finances, tracked the targets, and when things went wrong, handled the disappearing. They had done this at least 4 times that Ray could confirm. Each time, a widow's adult child. Each time, questions about estate documents. Each time, an attempt to obtain some form of financial control before the relationship ended, either with a payment or simply with vanishing. "We're near the end of their typical timeline," Ray said, spreading documents across my kitchen table. "Your son has been engaged to her for 4 months. Her previous engagements lasted between 4 and 7 months. She's getting ready to make her move." "What move?" I asked. Ray tapped a photograph of Diana at what appeared to be a social function, standing beside a man I didn't recognize. "Curtis," he said. "2 weeks ago at a Nashville restaurant. They met for 90 minutes. I have video." He paused. "Eleanor, she's going to approach you about signing something. That's how it's worked in every prior case, some document that looks routine. A financial advisory agreement, a property management arrangement, something that gets her name onto your accounts or your deed in any capacity." "Then we let her try," I said. Ray looked at me carefully. "You sure?" I thought about Frank's letter opener in her hand that November afternoon. I thought about my son pressing that note into my palm and the way his face had looked at Christmas dinner, watching her, something guarded and sad in his eyes that I had not let myself examine closely enough. "I'm sure. And my son needs to be part of this. He already knows something is wrong. He deserves to know everything." I called him that evening and asked him to come alone. He arrived within the hour, and we sat at the same kitchen table where I had sat with Ray and with Carol, and I told him everything I had found. I watched his face move through the stages of it, the disbelief, the resistance, the slow, terrible recognition. He had suspected something for 6 weeks. He had not wanted to be right. "She asked me twice about having you sign a financial advisory consent form," he said finally. "She said it was routine, that all her clients had one, that it would make it easier for her to help manage your affairs. She said you'd been overwhelmed since Dad died." He looked at the table. "I told her you had an attorney. How did she respond?" "She said attorneys were expensive and that it would be simpler to keep things informal." He exhaled through his teeth. "I thought maybe she was just trying to help. I wanted to believe that." "I know you did," I said. He looked up at me. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" "Because I needed proof. Because I knew what it would cost you to hear it, and I wasn't willing to ask you to pay that price unless I was certain." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What do we do now?" "We set a trap," I said, "and then we end it properly. All of it, out in the open, where she can't run and can't rewrite what happened." My son looked at Frank's photograph on the bookshelf, the one taken the summer they finished building this house. Frank standing on the front porch with sawdust on his shirt and that particular satisfaction on his face that only came from finishing something built to last. Then he looked back at me. "Okay, Mom, tell me what to do." The trap was Carol's idea in its legal architecture and Ray's in its execution. We needed Diana to attempt the document signing on camera with witnesses in position. Carol prepared what looked like a routine property management form, plausible enough to be convincing, with enough technical language that Diana would believe it was the opening she had been building toward for 9 months. My son called her on a Thursday and said I had been having a hard time lately, that I seemed confused sometimes, that he was worried about me managing everything on my own. He said it in the careful voice of a man who hated every word he was saying. He told her I was open to talking about some kind of advisory arrangement. She said she could come Saturday afternoon. She said it in the voice of someone who had been waiting. Saturday came clear and warm, the first genuinely warm day of spring. I spent the morning in the garden Frank had laid out behind the house, turning soil that had been dormant all winter, planting nothing, just putting my hands in the earth for the steadiness of it. Ray texted at noon. Cameras check, audio check, counsel standing by. My son arrived at 1, quieter than usual, and we sat on the porch and didn't talk much. Carol was parked on the county road a quarter-mile away. Ray was in position beyond the cedar trees. A Blount County Sheriff's deputy named Marcus Holt was in the driveway of the neighboring property. Diana arrived at 2:15 in a white sedan. She was wearing a blue blouse and carrying a leather portfolio. She hugged my son, kissed his cheek, looked at me with that warm, steady gaze I now understood for exactly what it was. A performance maintained through repetition. "Eleanor," she said, "you look wonderful. Come inside," I said. We sat in the living room. She accepted the glass of tea I offered, settled onto the couch across from me, and opened the portfolio on the coffee table. She produced a document, 2 pages, clipped together. She placed it in front of me. "I talked to your son about this," she said, her voice gentle and measured. "I've been thinking about it since we first met, honestly. You have so many moving pieces here. The land, Frank's investment accounts, the company legacy. Managing all of that alone is a lot." She tapped the document. "This is just an advisory agreement. It gives me the ability to help coordinate things on your behalf. Nothing changes hands. You're still in full control. This just allows me to open communication channels with your financial institutions." I picked up the document and looked at it for a long moment, then I set it back on the table. "Before I sign anything," I said, "I'd like to ask you something." She smiled. "Of course. Is your name Diane Holloway?" The smile didn't vanish. It held for just a fraction of a second longer than it should have, the way a flame holds before it goes out. Then she arranged her face into gentle confusion. "What? Eleanor, what are you talking about?" "Your name," I said again. "Is it Diane Holloway?" My son stood up from the chair beside the window. The front door opened, and Ray walked in, followed a moment later by Carol. Diana rose from the couch, her eyes moving quickly around the room, calculating exits, calculating whether this was recoverable. It was not recoverable. Ray set a folder on the coffee table, opened it, and laid out documents the way someone lays out cards. The marriage certificate, the shell company registration, the civil judgment from 2019, the photograph of her and Curtis at the Nashville restaurant, the records from Memphis, Savannah, Richmond, the photograph from her Tennessee driver's license, issued under her real name. "Diana Pratt," Carol said from the doorway. Her voice was even and deliberate. "Married to Curtis Webb, Shelby County, 2021. Attempting to enter a second marriage while legally wed is a criminal offense under Tennessee law. Attempting to obtain signature on a financial document through misrepresentation is fraud. We have camera footage of this conversation and documentation of 4 prior incidents following the same pattern." For one moment, Diana dropped it completely. Everything she had built and practiced and refined across years of targets fell away, and what was left was something hard and cold and very tired. Then she looked at my son. "Nathan," she started. "Don't," he said. His voice was quiet. He wasn't angry the way I had feared he might be, shaking and loud. He was just finished. Deputy Holt came through the front door. Curtis Webb, it turned out, had been parked at a coffee shop in the next county, waiting for a text from Diana that the document had been signed. He was picked up within the hour. I stood on the porch as the deputy's vehicle pulled out of the drive and watched until the dust settled back onto the gravel. My son stood beside me, his hands in his pockets, looking out at the ridge where the afternoon light was beginning its long fall toward evening. "I'm sorry," he said. "You have nothing to be sorry for. I should have listened to myself sooner." He shook his head slowly. "There were things I noticed and explained away, things that didn't add up." He paused. The night of your birthday dinner in January, she went through your study while you were in the kitchen. I saw her come out and she said she was looking for the bathroom, but the bathroom is in the other direction. I told myself I was imagining things. You weren't imagining things. No. He was quiet for a moment. She was good at making me feel like the problem was my own suspicion. That's the skill, I said. That's what they practice. We stayed on the porch until the light was almost gone. Inside, the house held Frank's tools, and Frank's chair and Frank's letter opener still sitting on the desk where she had touched it. It held 38 years of a life we had built carefully and quietly, not ostentatiously. Frank had always believed you kept your real life private, that the value of what you had built was not in displaying it but in protecting it. He had set up trusts and structures and legal frameworks that I had understood in principle, but never fully measured until I sat with Carol after his death and looked at the actual numbers. The land alone had appreciated to $4.8 million. Frank's company had sold 3 years before he died for $2.1 million. His patents, modest by industrial standards but consistent, generated income that I rarely touched. His investment accounts had grown in the quiet way of accounts managed by someone who understood compound patience. The total, when Carol laid it out after the funeral, had shocked me. We had never lived like wealthy people. We had lived like people who valued what they were building more than what they were displaying. Diana Pratt had known, or had calculated closely enough, that there was something substantial here. She had not known the real number. Almost no one did. I had not told my son the full figure for the same reason Frank had never told him while he was alive. Because knowledge of money before a person is ready for it tends to change them in ways they can't always recover from. My son had built his own career, his own life, his own sense of who he was. That had been the point. But standing on the porch that evening, I decided it was time. We went back inside and sat at the kitchen table and I told him everything. The land, the company's sale, the patents, the full number. I watched his face with the same attention I had given his face when he was small, and I was trying to understand what was happening inside of him. What I saw was not greed or calculation. What I saw was grief. Sudden and unguarded. The grief of understanding for the first time what his father had spent a lifetime quietly accumulating so that the people he loved would be protected. Dad never said anything. My son said softly. Your father believed that money was a tool for safety, not for display. He wanted you to know who you were before you knew what you had. My son looked at the bookshelf, at the photograph of Frank on the porch with sawdust on his shirt. Then he looked back at me. Is that why he set up the trust the way he did? Yes. No one touches it without your full consent and legal oversight. Not me, not an advisor, not a fiancé. It was designed to protect you. I looked at him steadily. It worked. It took several months for the legal proceedings to move through the system. Diana Pratt and Curtis Webb were charged in Tennessee with fraud, criminal impersonation, and attempted bigamy. 3 of the 4 families Ray had identified agreed to cooperate with the prosecution. In Memphis, the family that had previously stayed quiet came forward once they understood there would be strength in numbers. The case was solid enough that both Diana and Curtis accepted plea agreements. Diana received 4 years. Curtis received 3. My son took some time off from his architecture firm and spent several weeks at the house, longer than he had since he'd left for college. We planted Frank's spring garden together for the first time. He learned how to maintain the fence line. He fixed the hinge on the barn door that had been broken since November. We talked more in those weeks than we had in years, the kind of talking that happens when 2 people have come close to something terrible and are quietly grateful to be on the other side of it. He started seeing someone in the fall, a woman he'd known through work for years, a structural engineer named Claire who had none of Diana's practiced warmth but all of her own particular realness. He brought her to the house at Thanksgiving, and she walked the property in hiking boots and asked good questions about the timber and the water rights and whether the ridge was accessible by trail. She shook my hand firmly and met my eyes when she talked to me. That was enough. The day before Christmas, I added a stone bench to Frank's garden. The inscription was simple. Frank Marsh, 1952, 2022. He built things meant to last. I sat on that bench in the December afternoon and thought about what had come close to being taken from us. Not the money. though the money mattered as a practical instrument of safety. What had almost been taken was harder to name. Trust. My son's faith in his own judgment, the quiet legacy of a man who had spent his life building carefully and who deserved to have that building protected. Frank used to say that the most dangerous thing a person could do was let comfort override caution. Comfort is not the same as safety, he'd say. Safety requires attention. It requires someone willing to keep watching, even when it's easier to look away. I am 67 years old. I spent 29 years in emergency rooms learning that the situations that looked manageable were sometimes the ones moving fastest toward crisis. I learned to trust the feeling in my chest that said something was wrong before the monitors confirmed it. I trusted that feeling, and it kept us safe. If you're watching because someone in your life has been asking questions that feel like too much curiosity about the wrong things, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not paranoid. You are paying attention. Attention is the most undervalued form of protection there is. The pattern Diana Pratt followed is not uncommon. Financial predators who target the children of wealthy families, who use charm and manufactured intimacy to reach the assets they cannot access directly, these people exist and they are practiced. They rely on the reluctance of families to cause conflict, on the unwillingness of loving children to believe the worst about someone they love, on the politeness of older women who have been taught all their lives not to make a scene. Make the scene. Trust your gut. Call your attorney before you need your attorney. Frank built me a life and built it carefully. He built trusts and structures and protections, not because he thought I was weak, but because he understood that love, practical and clear-eyed, prepares for the things it hopes will never come. I hope this story stays with you. Not as entertainment, though I understand that is part of what it is, but as a reminder that the people who have spent their lives building something worth protecting deserve someone watching the perimeter. Subscribe if these kinds of stories matter to you. Share this if you know someone who might need to hear it. And leave a comment below because I want to know if you caught the red flags before I did. Most of you did. You're smarter than I was, and that's exactly what I was hoping for.